Alongside a pull-up bar, rings are an inexpensive, easily adjustable, and portable implement that can massively expand the possibilities of movements in your workouts. So, a set of gymnastic rings is essentially an amplifier of options that could make your training more challenging, varied, enjoyable, and quite possibly more sustainable as well. Buying a set of gymnastic rings is, without a doubt, the best 20 to 30 buck investment you'll ever going to make. Facts. However, having purchased a set of gymnastic rings doesn't necessarily mean that all your training should revolve around this implement. In fact, I typically program just one ring movement for the vast majority of my beginner clients, that is the inverted row. For everything else, I would much rather have them acquainted with the stable versions of the basic movements, which are typically done on solid surfaces like bars or on the ground. In the next few minutes, I'm going to analyze the 4 foundational movements I'd spent most of my time on if I was a complete beginner who just bought a set of gymnastic rings to put on some muscle mass and get stronger in the upper body overall. I'm fully aware that this selection is minimalistic and not quote-unquote optimal, but most noobs will benefit from a training style that is skewed towards simplification and lack of complexity, at least at the start. Alright, let's start with a time-tested staple that should be in every beginner's toolbox, the push-up. The push-up is essentially a dynamic plank where you go up and down in a quasi-straight line. The primary muscles involved in this movement are the front side of the shoulders, the chest, and the triceps. Basically all the muscle groups responsible for pushing objects away from you. Look, there are many ways to skin the cat when it comes to training calisthenics, but based on my personal training experience and the observations I've made as a coach for many years, is that for beginner lifters, the more stable, the better, at least at the start. If you insist on using rings because you're very excited about this implement, that's fine. You could definitely use more than one push-up variation in your program. But I would still favor the non-ring alternatives, especially if you are an absolute beginner. I'm talking about people who can't even do 5 proper push-ups on the floor yet. If that's you, you should focus on either knee-assisted or incline push-ups. If you truly want to improve your pressing strength mainly through calisthenics, stick to these 2 for a long enough period of time and you'll thank me later. However, I wouldn't be opposed to the idea of playing around with rings as long as the exercise selection matches your level of strength. Perhaps after an introductory phase, you could try holding isometric planks with straight arms. These stable variations will do a much better job at overloading a horizontal pressing movement so that you can improve your dynamic strength much faster, while the static planks will help you develop the global tension you need when training with unstable implements like rings. I'm not going to discuss the push-up technique in depth today because I don't want this episode to go on for too long. Instead, I'm going to refer to this video up here where I show you how to do a perfect push-up and the typical newbie mistakes you would want to avoid. If you're someone who can already do 10 regular push-ups on the floor with solid technique and control, then you could start experimenting with rings. But if this implement makes your performance tank in a massive way to the point where you can't even perform 5 good repetitions, I suggest you scale back the intensity to find a regression where you can do between 6 to 12 good reps. My go-to options would be to either assume a more favorable body angle so that you have to overcome less percentage of your own body weight of resistance, or the other option would be to use a band so that you can get some assistance, mostly in the bottom half of the push-up. The only issue I see with the latter is that you need to find a bar or something similar above your body so that you can loop the band. Time to move on to the inverted row, which is the opposite movement of the push-up. In a push-up, you press an object away from you in a horizontal line, whereas in an inverted row, you pull the object towards your body horizontally. Technique-wise, the cues are very similar. You have to keep a straight plank at all times, and you like to see your elbows go past your back line. The most common mistake I see people make when training the inverted row is their tendency to stick their head forward as if they wanted to score a header in soccer lingo, like this. By doing that, they're simply robbing their back muscles from the opportunity to work properly. What you want to do instead is to lead the movement with your chest sticking out, what I like to call a proud chest. This body position is going to maximize the contribution of the muscles you want to grow in your back. From an anatomical perspective, your whole upper back and the lats are going to do most of the work here. They also get some assistance from the backside of your shoulders, your biceps, and most relevant to my next point, your forearm muscles. Novices will soon realize that grip becomes an issue when doing rows. This is simply because of the position of your body relative to the rings. In a push-up, your body is above the rings, whereas in an inverted row, you're below the rings, so naturally you have to hold on to these for the entire duration of the set. From a coaching standpoint, rows also differ from push-ups in that I don't see an added benefit in doing inverted rows with a solid object like a bar. Rings allow for a more natural body movement that is joint-friendly, especially on your wrists and elbows, since your hands can move freely now. Additionally, rings also provide the freedom to easily adjust the intensity by changing body angles. The more parallel to the floor your body is, the harder it gets. The more vertical position you assume, the easier the rows become. Just make sure that you find a measurable, repeatable, and consistent angle that allows you to perform somewhere between 8 to 14 repetitions. If I want a client to be confronted with higher intensities and thus lower rep ranges, I could easily program harder exercises during vertical pulling movements, as you'll see later on. In any event, I've covered the inverted row very extensively on this channel, so I would recommend that you watch these two other videos where I show you the simplest way to progress this movement, as well as why the inverted row shouldn't be considered just a regression of the pull-up. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the pull-up. Many see this exercise as this huge mountain that is impossible to climb, where you can barely make out the peak. And to that I have to say, f the peak. Just focus on the next few steps in front of you first. And that first step is to become stronger at bodyweight rows while you also strengthen your grip. Those two pillars are going to lay a solid foundation to build upon afterwards. Then you can gradually introduce vertical pulling movements that resemble a pull-up to a degree. Negatives and band-assisted pull-ups provide the intensity and the specificity you'll eventually need. These two regressions are excellent practice to put your body under great stress through low reps in the same angles as the pull-up. On the other hand, inverted rows and feet-assisted pull-ups are fantastic movements for the trainee to accumulate a ton of pulling volume through higher repetitions. So far, everything has gone great with your training. Push-ups, boom. Rows, no problem. Pull-ups, I got this. But now you get to dips and you're gonna be like, "Aah!" But hey, this is normal, okay? We've all been there at some point. To my mind, it would make much more sense to pick a stable version where I could prioritize muscle gains through progressively overloading the exercise, as opposed to picking an unstable dip which requires global stability skill and some conditioning of the connective tissue at the elbow joint even before attempting to do a single repetition. This whole issue is caused by the position of your body relative to the rings, which is also going to determine the demands of the movement itself. The higher the percentage of your body that is above the two contact points, aka the gymnastic rings, the harder the exercise becomes from a muscle perspective. But if your body's below these, then the area that is stressed gets reduced to just your fingers. So grip strength could become a limiting factor during both rows, pull-ups, and variations thereof. Whereas during a ring dip, the limiting factor is mainly strength. The stress is no longer placed upon your ability to sustain a tight grip with your hand, but rather on your upper extremities in particular and your entire body in general to stabilize your position. And since novices are novices because they lack sufficient strength, why not use variations that remove the instability component altogether so that the trainee can solely focus on building up the strength of the main muscle movers in a dip, which by the way, these happen to be the same ones as in a push-up. So, the best thing you can do for your ring dips is to master the regular push-up and the parallel bar dips first. After a while, I wouldn't be against the idea of including isometric holds with rings, or perhaps you experiment with feet-assisted dips for a couple of months. Progressing these exercises would be really useful and a pretty smart thing to do, especially if you're planning on doing ring dips at some point in the foreseeable future. Now, let's picture a scenario where you've gotten quite good at both push-ups and dips, and you can actually hold a ring dip isometric at the top for a while with relative ease. However, you're still at a point where you can barely do a couple of ring dips. What could you do then? If you find yourself in this gray area, I'm certain that these two regressions will help you tremendously. The first option would be to use a light or extra light resistance band to give you a little bit of assistance at the bottom part. The issue I have with thicker bands is that they give you a false sense of strength which you haven't earned yet. And on this channel, I don't really care about you feeling great at the moment, but I do care about getting you stronger over time. So, find a band you can do at least 5 to 6 repetitions with, and make sure to perform a brief pause at the bottom of every single repetition in order to minimize the recoil bands produce as they get stretched. As you become stronger at the band dip regression, just make sure that you use an even thinner band in the next wave of progression. I know it sounds simple, but this is exactly what your training should be like. If you are not there yet in terms of pushing strength, no worries. I'd suggest that you go back to progressing the feet-assisted ring dips while you prioritize at least one isolation movement for the triceps. Look, in this section I can only give you general guidelines, so please process this information with a pinch of salt, and also make sure to adjust it to your specific goals, level of strength, and personal circumstances. Despite looking at all these different regressions, the truth of the matter is that specificity reigns supreme when it comes to resistance training. If you want to get better at ring push-ups, you have to train ring push-ups more often. The same applies to the other 3 movements I've discussed in this video. So, the value of using regressions is simply to bridge the gap between your strength goal and your current level of strength. That's it. As to what rep ranges to use, I tend to favor moderate intensities for complete beginners. Pick movements that you can only do between 8 to 14 reps when you generally apply yourself with an honest effort level during a set. As you become more confident in a given movement, then you might want to slowly introduce regressions that lend themselves better to lower rep ranges, something like band-assisted pull-ups and dips. If you are completely new to resistance training, performing 4 to 5 good sets of pulling movements and 4 to 5 sets of pressing movements in any given session should be more than enough for you. That would call for short workouts under 45 minutes. The goal of a workout is not to destroy your body, but rather to stimulate certain body parts while you practice specific movements on a regular basis. As you become stronger and thus you improve on your ability to tolerate more physical stress over time, then you can add a couple of sets here and there, or increase the intensity of a given exercise, or a combination of both. As for weekly frequency, I would say this. If you can only train twice per week, I would encourage you to complete slightly longer workouts, perhaps up to 60 minutes each. But if a higher frequency is a viable option, then I personally encourage novices to train at least 3 times per week for roughly 40 to 45 minutes each time. Of course, all these things will have to evolve over time, but these guidelines are reasonable enough for beginner lifters who've never done calisthenics training with rings before. If you want to see an expansion on other beginner-friendly movements done with gymnastic rings, just give me a thumbs up so that I know that you want me to put together a second part on ring training for novices. I really hope you found a ton of value in this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to choose all when you click on the bell to get notified every time a new video goes live. Stay fit, stay strong, help me raise an army of Super Saiyans all around the world. Peace.